Welcome to Scary Story Hour with the Archives. This intro is unscripted, so I'm kind of winging it as I record this. But I have quite a few stories for you all tonight. A couple shorts from the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark anthology, a story from Edgar Allen Poe, and a poem, and then an actual short story written by me. You probably heard me just slam my fist down on the desk when I did that. Sorry. Because I was reading all these stories and then looking up and seeing that there was barely any time recorded. And I don't want you guys to just sit down and listen to scary stories for like 10 minutes. So, there's quite a bit of content. And I hope that you guys enjoy it. And I'm sure there's more that I can say and then I can't think of anything. But yes, I love you guys. And thank you for supporting me and the podcast. And that creepy door creak that you heard was the dog, if you could hear it on the microphone. But let's go ahead and get into the stories. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool, green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the two men tended their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They both would laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they both were sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We've been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long, he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they'd escaped a great danger and began joking and singing, but when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere. But he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. The Haunted House. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 closer and closer, step, step, and it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. When the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide, this time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so that he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him on to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearthrug. He did, and he found a big sack of money, and where that haunt had held onto his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Rings on her fingers. Daisy Clark had been in a coma for more than a month when the doctor said that she had finally died. She was buried on a cool summer day in a small cemetery about a mile from her home. "May she always rest in such peace," her husband said. But she didn't. Late that night, a grave robber with a shovel and a lantern began to dig her up. Since the ground was still soft, he quickly reached the coffin and got it open. His hunch was right. Daisy had been buried wearing 2 valuable rings, a wedding ring with a diamond in it, and a ring with a ruby that glowed as if it were alive. The thief got down on his knees and reached into the coffin to get the rings, but they were stuck fast on her fingers. So he decided that the only way to get them was to cut off her fingers with a knife. But when he cut into the finger with the wedding ring, it began to bleed, and Daisy Clark began to stir. Suddenly she sat up. Terrified, the thief scrambled to his feet. He accidentally kicked over the lantern and the light went out. He could hear Daisy climb out of the grave. As she moved past him in the dark, he stood there frozen with fear, clutching the knife in his hand. When Daisy saw him, she pulled her shroud around her and asked, "Who are you?" When the grave robber heard this corpse speak, he ran. Daisy shrugged her shoulders and walked on, and never once looked back. But in his fear and confusion, the thief fled in the wrong direction. He pitched headlong into her grave, fell on the knife, and stabbed himself. While Daisy walked home, the thief bled to death. Clinkety clink. An old lady got sick and died. She had no family and no close friends, so the neighbors got a gravedigger to dig a grave for her, and they had a coffin made, and they placed it in her living room. As was the tradition, they washed her body and dressed her up in her best clothes and put her in the coffin. When she died, her eyes were wide open, staring at everything and seeing nothing. The neighbors found 2 old silver dollars on her dresser, and they put them on her eyelids to keep them closed. They lit candles and sat up with her so that she would not be too lonely on that first night that she was dead. The next morning, a preacher came and said a prayer for her. Then everybody went home. Later, the gravedigger arrived to take her to the cemetery and bury her. He stared at the silver dollars on her eyes, and he picked them up. How shiny and smooth they were. How thick and heavy. They're beautiful, he thought. Just beautiful. He looked at the dead woman, with her eyes wide open. He felt like she was staring at him, watching him hold her coins. It gave him a creepy feeling. He put the coins back on those eyes of hers to keep them closed. But before he knew it, his hands reached out again and grabbed the coins and stuck them in his pocket. Then he grabbed a hammer and quickly nailed shut the lid on the coffin. "Now you can't see anything," he said to her. Then he took her out to the cemetery, and he buried her as fast as he could. When the gravedigger got home, he put the 2 silver dollars in a tin box and shook it. The coins made a cheerful rattling sound, but the gravedigger wasn't feeling cheerful. He couldn't forget those eyes looking at him. When it got dark, a storm came up, and the wind started blowing. It blew all around the house. It came in through the cracks and around the windows and down the chimney. Bazoo! It went. Bizzy, bizzy, bazoo! The fire flared and flickered. The gravedigger threw some fresh wood on the fire, got into bed, and pulled the blankets up to his chin. The wind kept blowing. Bazoo! It went. Bizzy, bizzy, bazoo! The fire flared and flickered and cast evil-looking shadows on the walls. The gravedigger lay there thinking about the dead woman's eyes staring at him. The wind blew stronger and louder, and the fire flared and flickered and popped and snapped, and he got more and more scared. Suddenly he heard another sound. Clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. It went. Clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. It was the silver dollars rattling in the tin box. "Hey!" the gravedigger shouted. "Who's taking my money?" But all he heard was the wind blowing. Bizzy, bizzy, bazoo! And the flames flaring and flickering and snapping and popping, and the coins going clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. He leaped out of the bed and chained up the door. Then he hurried back. But his head had barely touched the pillow when he heard clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. Then he heard something way off in the distance. It was a voice crying, "Where is my money? Who's got my money? Who? Who?" And the wind blew, bizzy, bizzy, bazoo! And the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the money went clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. The gravedigger was really scared. He got out of bed again and piled all the furniture against the door, and he put a heavy iron skillet over the tin box. Then he jumped back into bed and covered his head with the blankets. But the money rattled louder than ever, and way off a voice cried, "Give me my money! Who's got my money? Who? And the wind blew, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the gravedigger shivered and shook and cried, "Oh, Lordy, Lordy!" Suddenly the front door flew open, and in walked the ghost of the dead woman with her eyes wide open, staring at everything and seeing nothing. And the wind blew, "Bazee, bazee, bazoo!" And the money went clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. And the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the ghost of the dead woman cried, "Oh, where is my money? Who's got my money? Who? And the gravedigger moaned, "Oh, Lordy, Lordy." The ghost could hear her money going clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink in the tin box, but her dead eyes couldn't see the box. So she reached out with her arms and tried to find it. The wind went, "Bazee, bazee, bazoo!" And the money rattled, clinkety-clink, clinkety-clink. And the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped. And the gravedigger shivered and shook and moaned, "Oh, Lordy, Lordy." And the woman cried, "Give me my money! Who's got my money? Who?
You got it!
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him, and every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern, cautiously, oh so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights. Every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber, and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no, His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. Steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew that sound well. Many a night just at midnight when all the world slept, it was welled up from my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had been found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out of the crevice and full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder. I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs, and then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber, and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them, at length, to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted familiar things, but ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt, I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, but the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. The Raven, by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my book's surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. That is it, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortals ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, something louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but, with mine of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door. Perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. Perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though the crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answers little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on that placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at this stillness, broke by reply so aptly spoken. Doubtless, said I, what it utters, it is only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I willed a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking, fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking, Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er. But whose velvet violet lining would the lamplight gloating o'er? She shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nepenthe from the memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind of nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if birds or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest toss thee here ashore. Desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if, within the distinct Aden, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or friend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. The Christmas Bones. As long as I can remember, my mother put bones under the Christmas tree. No other kids I knew put bones under their Christmas tree, just presents. But my mother put bones under the Christmas tree every year. When I'd ask why, she would tell me that it was an old folk tradition, something my granny had taught her, and that she'd teach me about it when I was older. The underside of the tree would stay bare until the 22nd of December. After I was snug in bed, she would put them out like some horror movie Santa, and I would wake up the next morning to the heap of bones under the tree. Each year, there would be more. A new skull, an extra tibia, another femur. I'd ask her where they came from, and she would always tell me that she would explain everything when I was older. That told me nothing. It was getting to the point where there were more bones than presents, but my mother made sure I always had plenty of gifts on Christmas morning. And it was usually just the two of us for Christmas. Some years it was me, Mom, and her current boyfriend, but the relationship never lasted through Christmas, and the man was usually gone and out of the picture by the morning of. Mom always said she had the worst luck with men, even my father. He ran off when I was 3, and we never saw him again. It was fine, though, because I was perfectly happy with it just being me and my mother, without anyone else to possibly destroy our Christmas. But I grew up, and I grew lonely. Lonely for companionship. Lonely for companionship that wasn't my mother. I wanted romance. I had no idea what I was doing when it came to dating, but I met someone in town, we hit it off, got coffee a few times, saw a movie or two, and I thought it would blossom from there. Eventually, we did become serious. But my mother didn't like him. I figured it had something to do with her personal feelings on relationships, considering her history, but after a few months, she seemed to warm up to the idea of him in my life. I was ecstatic because I was sure I was in love. But what did I really know about anything? More bones, Mom? I asked as she walked into the kitchen on the morning of the 22nd. Sadly, no. She sounded off as she spoke with her back to me, her hands moving methodically as she prepared her coffee like she did every morning. Too bad. I was being sarcastic, but I felt rather awful because I knew what the bones meant to her. Maybe I can go out into the woods and find you some. You know I have a knack for that. I offered my services as a finder of weird and obscure things, but my mother waved her hand at me. No need. I will find something to go under the tree. She waved her hand at me before she turned around with her coffee cup to her lips. You're sure? I softened my tone a bit more. Yes, baby. It's not time for you to carry on the tradition yet. Her words sounded strange as she smiled wryly at me and left the kitchen. This mood was very unlike her, especially this time of year. There was always a severity to her demeanor when the weather started to get really cold, but she still kept a rather jovial air. But not now. Not today. Something was wrong, but I couldn't place it, and she clearly wasn't talking. I had to get to class or I would have hounded her about what was eating at her, but I figured I would just let her sit with herself for a few hours until I got home from class. Maybe then I would be able to coax it out of her. It was the last day before classes ended for the semester. They released earlier than usual, and I was able to make it home while the sun was still high and the day still bright and somewhat cheerful, despite the ever-graying thickness of impending snow clouds. The flakes would start to fall soon, and I knew that the whole of the land would be stark white by the time the sun completely set. How appropriate for the solstice. When I arrived home, the front door was slightly ajar, and I immediately felt a sense of dread deep in my stomach. It was quickly replaced by a fluttering as my mother burst through the door before I could even make it up the stairs. Her hands were full of leather cords, a metal symbol hanging from the bottom of each. She didn't say a word to me as she stepped up a ladder and began hanging them from the fresh nails embedded in the underside of the porch awning. "Mom, what are you doing?" I paused with my foot on the stairs as I gawked at her. She immediately stopped what she was doing and turned her head to look at me as if she had no idea I was there before I spoke. "Decorating," she smiled at me, but something was so very wrong about that smile. For what? Because those don't look like Christmas lights." I pointed at one of the symbols forged in cold iron. It had a large loop at the top where the iron had been carefully shaped and folded over itself, the ends neatly curled inward with a small spiral. "The solstice. We're doing something a little different this year." My mother smiled at me again. This time the lie behind it was a little more convincing. "And what are those symbols?" I asked curiously. I felt like I had seen them somewhere before, probably in a movie, but I couldn't quite figure out where. They're troll crosses. Christians put up crosses for Jesus. We put up troll crosses for the solstice." She nodded with another weird smile and went back to decorating. "The crosses are used at Easter, Mom, not Christmas. Baby Jesus was born on Christmas and died around Easter. If they're hanging up crosses around other times of the year like you are hanging these, they're probably trying to ward away evil like every haunted house movie." I had a feeling, and I definitely didn't like it. My mother had hung the last of the troll crosses and stopped dead on her top step of the ladder before she took a very deep breath and sighed. "Happy solstice, baby. I made some cookies this morning after you left for class if you want some. They're on the kitchen table." She never looked at me as she climbed down off the ladder and calmly walked back inside. I was left standing there, one foot still on the stairs, alone. She completely ignored what I said, dismissed me, and went about her business as if we had never had the conversation about the troll crosses. This was the first time I had ever seen them, at least in a way that I could remember, and there was something eerily unsettling about the dozens of iron sigils swaying in the icy breeze that had begun to blow. The snow was coming, and it looked to be heavy, so I convinced myself that my mother knew how bad the storm could be and put the crosses up to protect us from the impending blizzard. But I knew I was convincing myself of a lie. I had fallen asleep. I couldn't get my mother to talk to me about anything. After she had hung the troll crosses and disappeared inside, I found her in the kitchen making something in a pot on the stove before she transferred it to the iron one that she hung in the fireplace around this time of year. Usually she was making barley stew, but whatever this concoction was, it was not barley stew. When I asked about the recipe, she turned to me and smiled, but never said a word. I had never seen her act so bizarrely, and I was starting to get concerned, but I couldn't get her to communicate with me, and in my frustration, I hid myself in my room with my headphones on and a new book. I had been studying so hard for my finals and spending long afternoons with the animals, preparing them for the bitter cold of winter, trying my best to pull my weight while still getting an education. So, inevitably, I fell asleep. But I woke up abruptly for some reason. There was this sound. No, a sensation. A vibration in the air that was heavy, a low thrum that reverberated through every fiber of my being. It felt large, tall and hulking, intimidating, foreboding, threatening. I was instantly on the defensive as I leapt out of the bed, but quietly made my way to the door. It was partially open, and I knew just the right speed to swing it in so that it made no sound. The weight of the vibration intensified as soon as the door was wide open, and I could hear my mother whispering loudly in the living room. Her words should have made sense, but my brain couldn't wrap itself around the sounds to translate them. All I knew is that they were angry and desperate. Then something replied. It was the vibration. It rippled through the air with such a weight that I felt like I was sinking. Every limb, every bone, every organ felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It spoke words that sounded more like earthquakes rumbling deep within the earth, and I had to clutch my throat so that I didn't make a choking sound, my whole body completely disoriented. Whatever it said caused my mother to cry out in strangled anguish. She was begging it in that tongue that I couldn't understand. I forced myself to crawl to the top of the stairs. I could tell the conversation was getting heated, and I had to see who she was talking to. It was either going to end one of two ways. The vibrato would leave in a deliberate act of ending the conversation, or it would escalate into violence, and I didn't know if I could even help her. My mother continued to beg and plead, but the vibration had had enough, and it bellowed so loudly that I feared my skull would split in two. The front door blew open with a phantom gust. icy cold air blowing in swirls of downy snow. I had just made it to the top stairs in time to see the backside of something as it exited the house. There were 3 of them that I saw on the edge of the porch as the door slammed shut on its own, and my mother's sobs began to echo through the house. What I saw was impossible. I was still asleep. There was no arguing that. This had to be a dream, because the beings that I saw leaving my house angrily were heads taller than the 7-foot Yule tree, and just seeing their backside as they left caused my whole body to involuntarily shudder in fear. I was in shock. I knew that feeling, but I wanted to wake up. My mother's sobs should have woken me up. "Mommy?" I called out meekly from the top of the stairs. I wasn't asleep. "Baby?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, and I could hear her choking them back. "Did I wake you?" You didn't wake me." I finally pulled myself to my feet and clung to the banister for support as I carefully guided myself down the stairs. "No?" She appeared at the bottom before I had fully made it down. Her face was stark white, save for the smears on her face, the streaks of dark red that also covered her fingers and hands. "Who were they, Mom?" I wasn't going to let her avoid me any longer. "Who was who, baby? Were you sleepwalking again?" She tried. She tried to change the subject and avoid telling me what was going on. No, you're not doing this to me. I know you're just trying to protect me, but you're not going to avoid telling me the truth. Do you think that you can just smile, bake me cookies, and eventually I'll stop asking questions? Mom, you know that we don't do that. We've never done that. And especially now. I'm officially an adult, and I think that you should be able to talk to me like one. What the hell is going on?" I gestured at the blood on her hands and the snow that had gathered on the floor just inside the threshold. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with bruised eyes, dark with lack of sleep and exhaustion. If she wasn't going to explain, I was going to figure it out anyway, and I began my descent of the stairs once again. This got my mother to finally move as she tried to prevent me from passing her at the bottom, but I asserted my size and tried to politely push past her. She grabbed me roughly by the arms and tried to push me back up the stairs. I couldn't let that happen, and even in my surprise that she had put her hands on me like that, I was determined to discover what she wanted to keep me in the dark about. I didn't mean to throw her like I did. It wasn't a violent gesture, but my mother, in her tired state, lost her balance and fell against the stairs. She slid to the bottom, calling out for me to stop as I turned into the living room to a grisly sight. The old rug that my mother had woven was soaked in blood. Laying atop it was what looked like a person, or had once been a person, in a hurried state of dismemberment. It was definitely a man based on the face that was staring back at me, glassy blue eyes now foggy in death. He looked like he had been hacked at in a frantic state. Nothing was neatly in pieces, and the flesh was torn as if gnashed at by wolves. At first I didn't recognize him because I probably would have done much more than turn and vomit right next to the Yule tree. "Mom?" My voice didn't sound like my own as it escaped my lips. I could feel the vomit still in the corners of my mouth and used the sleeve of my sweater to wipe it away. I didn't care about how gross that was with the image before me. "You have to let me explain." My mother came up behind me with a confidence in her voice unlike the way she had been speaking throughout the day. "Let you explain?" My voice pitched as I backed away from her closer to the tree. "There is a chopped up dead man on our living room rug, Mom! What the fuck is going on?" I contradicted myself, but the shock had gotten to a point where I just needed answers, and I needed them now before I made the decision to run, terrified from the house, terrified of my own mother. I said, "I will explain, but I need you to not interrupt me. This is a long story that I have dreaded having to tell you for the majority of your life." My mother paused, motioning for me to follow her to the kitchen. It was as if she just realized that she was covered in someone else's dried blood. As much as I didn't want to follow, my feet had other plans. She went straight to the sink and adjusted the handle for warm water before she began to speak. "I don't know what you saw besides the man in the living room, but I'm going to start from the beginning and try to get it all out while I can. When you were 3, you started to get headaches. We didn't realize that was what was going on at first, but you were inconsolable most of the time, and we had to go through months of testing before we determined what the problem was. You had a brain tumor." My mother spoke loud enough for me to hear her over the running water. "A brain tumor? I had a brain tumor? How had she never told me this before? I can see you wanting to ask questions, but I need you to wait. We discovered the tumor, and soon after the doctors told us that it was malignant and basically gave you no more than 6 months to live. It was inoperable, and there was nothing they could do. We basically were waiting for you to die. My mother had finished washing her hands, wiped down her face, and had now come to stand by the kitchen table. She made me sit with my back to the living room and took a chair across from me as she went on. Your father and I had already separated when I found out about the tumor. I met up with him to let him know, but his only concern was how much it was going to cost him in hospital bills to keep you alive just a bit longer. I should have killed him right then, but I'm glad I didn't. My mother had a wistful look on her face, but she continued on. Your granny was not happy about this, which was to be expected, but what she suggested to me was ludicrous and out of the question. My mother had taken a cigarette from her purse hung on the back of the chair and lit it. She never smoked in the house. What did Granny think you should do? I couldn't help myself. Did I make a pact with the Frost Ettons? Do what now? Mom, what are you talking about? As if the dead man in my living room wasn't crazy enough, I needed just a bit more insanity in my life. The Frost Ettons will make pacts, deals with humans for the right price. She suggested that I make an offering to the Ettons and ask them for aid. I didn't think they'd show. I never thought they'd come, but they did. They accepted my measly offering of cooked meat, and they came. I pleaded my case, and they accepted that too. They said they could spare your life, but it would come at a price. My mother paused again, this time with her eyes fixed on me. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. She just stared. What was the cost? I had to know, and I knew that I had to pull it out of her. Death was coming for you, and the only way to stop it from taking you was with yearly offerings. The Ettons froze the tumor, keeping it from growing any further, keeping it from affecting your brain. In return, I was to hold a blot every solstice, their time of the year, and sacrifice a life for every year that they added onto yours. My mother's stoic expression broke, and silent tears began to well in her eyes. A human life? I thought I understood that much. A human life. A human life would be sacrificed, the flesh given to the Ettons as offerings, the blood to aid another year of your life, and the bones. And the bones ended up under the tree. A shiver crept up my spine as the sudden realization of the bones that had been a norm of my holidays since I could remember belonged to once living, breathing people that my mother had murdered. You killed people? I asked, tears now hot on my cheeks. Of course she killed someone. He was dead in the other room, but I hadn't expected multiple someones. I had to, baby. If I didn't, you died. Your heartless wretch of a father was the first to go. A decision that I didn't need to take time to make. The bones were placed under the tree, one from each sacrifice, as a warning and ward to death. Your dues are still being paid and your life extended. There are 15 under the tree right now. My mother started to relax as she lit up another cigarette. But I'm 19 and you couldn't find a new bone for this year. I now understood why she had been so upset this morning. She couldn't find a sacrifice in time. I didn't have time to mull over the revelation that my father never actually ran off. Not exactly. I had no problem finding the offering. My fear was that it wouldn't be accepted. The tears started again as my mother blew out a huge puff of smoke. She was making me want one. And based on what I heard, even though I couldn't understand it, I took a ragged breath. It wasn't accepted. Always so intuitive you are. No, they didn't accept it. That was a wasted sacrifice, but it also wasn't my best work. My mother's words sounded calloused, but I was trying to see this situation from her perspective. I don't understand. Why accept it for this long and then all of a sudden... Why let me die now? What was the point? Why wasn't this sacrifice as good as the others? Panic had set in that I could possibly die at any moment without being able to defend myself. Baby, shh. No, calm down. They didn't rescind the pact. They just won't accept the sacrifice and offering from me. My mother had risen from her chair and come to embrace me, to comfort me in my anxious state. Why? Did they think you cheated them? Do they want more? I couldn't comprehend what I was feeling. I didn't want to die, but I didn't want any more to die just to keep me alive. The internal confliction was causing my throat to tighten and my hands to shake. Stop. Take a deep breath and listen to me. My mother gently took my face in her hands and commanded me to look at her. Those men, all those boyfriends that I had through the years, I chose them because they were a waste. They were repeat offenders, abusing women, hurting animals, manipulators, gaslighters. They were men who were never going to learn, and I chose them for this reason. The Ice Etten loved the taste of scum like them, devouring all the trash that pollutes the worlds. Me and the Ettens, did the worlds a favor, and it saved your life. But I'm only responsible for that life while you are still a child. Laws are different here than they are where the Ettens come from, so they let me be responsible for you just a bit longer. My mother was clearly trying to stay strong, but I could hear the breaks in her voice. What are you trying to tell me, Mom? I had a sudden sense of dread wash over me. I made 15 sacrifices in your favor. I took 15 lives. 16, but 15 lives so that you could have 15 more. But part of the contract states that when you become an adult, the pact is transferred to you. You are responsible for the lives taken to save your own. That is why the Ettens didn't accept my offering, and they were firm on that. My mother's face hardened as she spoke those last words. There was nothing she could do. The minute she made the 15th pact last year, right before I turned 18, the responsibility became mine. But she had never told me. She had tried to carry my weight without letting me know that there was even a burden to be carried, and I knew. I knew that she was holding tremendous guilt for that now, because in trying to keep me from becoming a murderer like her, it may have been the one thing that actually killed me. So I have to kill someone to get another year. I wanted to be straight on this and make sure that I understood completely. Yes, there's no real discrimination, but the dirtier the soul, the better. That doesn't matter, though. I'm going to go through your grand's old books and find a loophole, find some way that you won't ever have to walk this road. My mother broke again and took my hands, assuring me that she would make it right. But I thought about it. I thought about all the sacrificing she had done to keep me alive, to love me, to educate me, to send me to school and protect me to the point that she never really got a chance to be happy outside of us. She deserved to be happy, and me being dead wouldn't make her happy. No, Mom, you're not fixing this. You don't have to protect me anymore. You've done so much for me, sacrificed so much that I can't even imagine, and I want you to be able to relax, to be happy, to not have to worry about me all the time. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do, and sometimes they are hard, and sometimes people won't agree with it, but I believe what you did was right. No one will miss those sorts of people. You get to finally live your life. I can live mine. The worlds are a better place. But it's a heavy price. A whole life for just 1 year? I hesitated in my confident speech. But a year for you would do a world of difference for good when they will never do a single good thing for the world in their lifetime. If you choose this route, you are committed to the pact. The moment that you decide that you don't want to make a sacrifice is the moment you forfeit your life to them. And if you're going to do this, you have to choose a sacrifice soon before Yule comes to an end, and you don't have long. My mother bolstered my confidence in her own. This would be a big decision to make. You know, you were right about him. I painted a pretty picture for you so that you liked him, but he's not a good man. The things he's done to me. I closed my eyes, trying not to recall the trauma that I had held in regards to my boyfriend, the man that I couldn't get away from, the man that I had loved. And I'm not the first. I can't get away, Mom. I've tried. The fact that I was able to come here was a miracle because he wanted me to stay at the apartment with him for Christmas, but I told him that it was a tradition and I had to be here. I had to sneak out while he was sleeping, and I'm surprised he hasn't come looking for me. Maybe it's the snow. I rambled on, not sure where I was going with this. What are you trying to say, baby? Are you trying to tell me that you want your first sacrifice to be him? My mother narrowed her eyes at me. I could see the pure hatred and rage behind them for the man I thought I loved. We don't have much time, do we? I spoke with no emotion. The decision was made. Good choice. The Ettens will be pleased. My mother kissed my forehead. Now, get back to bed while I clean the mess up in the living room. We have a lot of work to do in just a few short days. Oh, by the way, Happy Yule. My mother handed me a cookie from the plate on the table before grabbing the box of garbage bags and the mop. Happy Yule, Mom. I smiled, shaking my head as I took a bite of cookie. She had made enough sacrifices for me, and it was due time that I returned the favor for her. As always, thank you guys so much for putting up with my fumbles while I read. I think I'm getting better, though, so that's good. But I hope that this brought you all a little spooky joy this Halloween evening, since this year has kind of been a wreck. And I know that those of you listening to this are huge fans of Halloween, and it sucks not being able to go out and do anything, but at least you can listen to a couple scary stories and maybe sleep sweet tonight. But like I said before, I love you guys so much, and I hope you have a wonderful Halloween.